It's interesting, when I wrote this new book, the idea was that I would go around the world and talk to business leaders, CEOs of many different kinds of companies, big and small and new and old, and companies that do different things, and find out what they thought about the power of simplicity and how they bring it into their organizations. And that, the idea was that if you hear what these people have to say, then it would give you ideas about how you might simplify your own organization. So I heard a lot of really interesting points of view, and there were some that were unique to their specific businesses, but might be applicable to other businesses as well. But then there were a number of things that were common to all of them, or many of them. And I thought that was interesting because people in different industries still had, similar feelings about the way they like to hire people, or the importance of culture in their organization, and what they did to make their culture stronger. So I think there's value in hearing the opinions of people who have succeeded already, that might influence the way you look at your own organization. I don't think Apple has lost its values. I think their market has changed a lot. And because the market has evolved, they've done certain things. And a lot of people look at Apple and say, well, that's not the way it was when Steve Jobs was there, and they criticize. So a good example is when Apple came out with the smaller phone last year. A lot of people said, well, now Apple has 3 kinds of phones out there, and that's making things more complicated, and that's not what Apple's all about. But they are conveniently forgetting that when the iPod was a revolutionary device for Apple, over the years, suddenly there were 2 and 3. That product line expanded because the market increased and there were different needs for different people. So things like that don't bother me at all. I think that's very consistent with Apple's values. You could look at its marketing, for example, and say it doesn't seem to be quite what it was before. And advertising is a little different because it's driven by someone's taste, and Steve Jobs had very high level of taste and standards. And I think other people may think they're doing a fabulous job, but they're different people and they have different values. So I personally look at the marketing and I kind of wish it was more like it used to be. But product-wise, I don't have those issues, and I think Apple can't be the same without Steve Jobs because he was unique. But Steve's goal was to instill his values into Apple so that if the company continued to operate on those values, it would succeed in the future. And I do believe that Apple still has the same values. I think when Apple starts making cheap products to satisfy what a lot of critics say, Apple should make cheap products so that they can sell more in the developing countries and things like that, that would be a change in Apple's values. And it would diminish their brand of being an exclusive, high-end quality brand, and just bending to public sentiment. And I don't think Apple wants to behave that way. I think Apple makes premium products for a premium customer who's willing to pay more because he or she believes it's worth more. So I think their product development sort of is always in that area where we got what's the best quality product, the most innovative, best designed, easiest to use, all that kind of stuff. A product that would also give people amazing new capabilities. So I think everything they've done in the last 5 years without Steve has been consistent with that. Where you could argue, I suppose, is whether they've done things quickly enough. And I have some issues with that personally, but I'm not privy to what happens inside Apple, and I know they have many different projects going on, some that ultimately become real products and some that don't. So I don't think for a second that they're not thinking about these things anymore, but every product takes a different amount of time to develop, and when they're ready, they release the product. Again, when I see products that don't match Apple's values, then I would worry about them. But the timing of the products isn't as big a concern to me because I know that Apple only releases a product when it's ready. And sometimes it might take 6 years, sometimes it might take 2 years. Like I say, if I saw products that made me feel like Apple was abandoning its values, I think it would be time to sell my stock, but I'm keeping it for now. I think people have talked about the ad industry as being in a revolutionary state for more years than I can remember, because social media changed everything, and there's always something new coming, but I think the essence of advertising will always remain the same. You need a great idea, and then once you have an idea, you can express it best in different media in different ways. So I think there's this natural evolution where companies buy up other companies, and then suddenly the young companies spring up again and they grab the work from the big companies. It's just this ongoing thing. I think the ad industry will forever be, I'd say, stuck in a loop, but it's not stuck. It's always moving forward. But it always moves forward in the same way, where bigger companies get bigger, and then young companies come along and steal their business, and then someone buys those companies and whatever. When I was last in a big ad agency, that's when digital and traditional advertising was kind of merging, and there were two very different skill sets, and the two weren't really very nice to each other either. In my own agency, there was a war going on about who could have the best ideas, and the digital guys were a little bit more technical, and the traditional guys were more conceptual, and they didn't necessarily like each other. And I think as the world evolves, that kind of thing takes care of itself. And when I talk about the ad industry evolving, I always say it's always evolving, but it's always not evolving. The same kinds of things happen over and over again, where something happens and people talk about how it's revolutionizing the business, and then that becomes the norm, and then something new comes along. So that's how I feel about that. But the second part of your question, I don't think Apple could run Think Different today, because it was such a thing in a particular moment in time. You have to keep in mind that Apple was near bankruptcy when that campaign was created, and it had a definite job to do. It was a brand campaign that described Apple, but at the same time, it was designed to reinvigorate the people who worked inside Apple, and it was designed to remind customers that Apple was still inventive and devoted to the technology of creativity. And even though it hadn't been successful in so many years, at that time it had really been had become mediocre. So that campaign did an amazingly good job of sort of addressing all those groups, the current customers, previous customers, employees of Apple. And it basically said, this is what Apple believes in. And when you see the products that are coming, they're going to fit in perfectly with this idea, which they did. The iMac was a real Think Different product. iBook after that, and Airport, and all these different things that built on this idea of thinking different. Today, Apple is a wildly successful company. Someone once wrote an article a couple of years ago, I think, when people first started to say, maybe Apple is slowing down, not being as innovative anymore. They should run a new campaign like Think Different. And I don't think it would work, because when you're fighting for your life and you're trying to shake people by the shoulders and say, this is what we stand for, people know what Apple stands for, and they have done a few things in recent years that try to sort of engage customers on this loftier level about why we do what we do. And I never bought any of them, to be honest. They just feel like Apple's trying to, it's like they're protesting too much. Like, hey, we're still relevant. We do things that are really important. And I think the products really speak for themselves. And if the products aren't communicating that, then Apple is in serious trouble. And just running an ad campaign that's going to say, no, really, we're really good, doesn't solve the problem. So I don't think it's the right time to run a brand campaign. I think they need to continue thinking different with their products. And if they're not doing that, then they have a lot of rethinking to do. But I think they are doing that and should continue to do that and not try to engage people on some high philosophical level when it's really the products that matter.